It's just infuriating, right? Like when you really
Yeah.
stop and think about the sheer amount of money, billions, literally billions of dollars, just wasted, just gone every year because of gang violence.
It's a staggering figure for sure.
But honestly, for me, the money is almost beside the point. What really gets me fired up, what really makes my blood boil, is the human cost. You know, the lives lost, the communities living in fear, the potential just completely snuffed out.
Yeah, no, I hear you on that. The human cost is immeasurable. And that's what we're going to try to unpack in this deep dive: the why, the how, and most importantly, what can actually be done to change things.
Exactly. So today we're diving deep into the world of gangs in America. We're going to look at their history, the current situation, the economics of it all, which is just mind-blowing. But like you said, the main focus, the real heart of this deep dive, is exploring the solutions, the real, concrete, evidence-based things that are actually working to combat this problem.
And we're going to do that by looking at everything from the historical context to the hard data to the personal stories of those who have been directly impacted.
So let's start with the basics. When we say gangs, what are we actually talking about? Like, what's the real definition and how did this whole thing even start? It feels like it's been a problem forever.
Well, you're right. It has been an issue for a long time. And the definition can be a little bit fluid, but generally speaking, a gang is considered to be a group of three or more people who identify as a gang and engage in some form of criminal activity.
Okay, that makes sense. But where did it all begin? Like, how did these groups even form in the first place?
Well, if you look back historically, gangs often emerge during times of significant social and economic upheaval.
Times of upheaval. Can you give us an example?
Sure, take the Prohibition era, for instance. A lot of those illegal alcohol operations were run by what were essentially early gangs. They were highly organized, incredibly violent, and deeply entrenched in their communities.
Wow. So gangs have been around for a while. And what about more recent examples? Like, what about a gang like MS-13? We hear a lot about them in the news. How did they come about?
MS-13 is a really complex case, but their roots can be traced back to the social and political turmoil in Central America in the 1980s. Many of the original members were refugees who fled to the U.S. and ended up forming gangs for protection and a sense of belonging in a new and often hostile environment.
So it's not just about like bad kids making bad choices. There are these deeper underlying factors at play.
Absolutely. And one of the key things to understand is that gangs often take root in communities that have been marginalized, communities that lack access to resources, opportunity, even a basic safety.
And that marginalization, that lack of opportunity, that's a big part of what fuels the anger and the violence, right?
Exactly. It creates a sense of desperation, a feeling of being trapped, and that can lead people, especially young people, to seek out a sense of power and belonging in places where they feel seen and heard, even if those places are harmful.
So looking at the U.S. today, in 2024, how big of a problem are gangs?
It's a huge problem. The most recent data from the National Gang Center, which came out in 2022, estimates that there are over 33,000 active gangs operating in the U.S. with an estimated 1.4 million members.
1.4 million. That's just, wow. That's more people than live in some states.
It's a staggering number. And it's a problem that affects every state in the country, every community.
So we've talked about the history, we've talked about the sheer scale of the problem, but you mentioned something earlier that I want to go back to those underlying factors, the things that really drive people to join gangs. Can you break that down a little bit more for us?
Sure, I mean, it's never just one thing, right? It's always this complex web of interconnected issues.
A web, that's a good way to put it. So what are some of the threads of that web?
Well, poverty is huge. When people are desperate, when they feel like they have no other options, they're more likely to make choices they wouldn't otherwise make.
Makes sense.
And then you have systemic racism, which limits access to resources, to education, to jobs, to housing, and that lack of opportunity, that feeling of being shut out, it breeds resentment, it breeds anger.
It's like a self-perpetuating cycle.
Exactly. And then you layer on top of that the lack of positive role models, the absence of strong community support systems, the easy availability of guns, and the constant exposure to violence. And it's just this perfect storm for gang activity.
And then there's the trauma, right? The generational trauma that gets passed down from one generation to the next.
Oh, absolutely. Trauma is huge. When kids grow up surrounded by violence, when they experience violence themselves, it changes them. It makes them more likely to be both victims and perpetrators of violence in the future. And that cycle just keeps repeating itself.
It's a really bleak picture. But it's important to understand all these factors.
Yeah.
It helps us see that this isn't just about bad people making bad choices. It's about systems that are failing entire communities.
Right. And it's about understanding that we can't just arrest our way out of this problem. We have to address the root causes, the underlying issues, if we want to see real lasting change.
So can you give us a concrete example? Like, how do these factors play out in a real-world setting?
Sure. Think about a place like Chicago's South Side. You have decades of disinvestment, discriminatory housing policies, concentrated poverty, and just a complete lack of opportunity. It's a breeding ground for gangs.
In Los Angeles, they've had a long history of gang violence too,
Yeah.
right?
And in LA, the gang issue is also deeply intertwined with racial tensions, with economic hardship, with the constant influx of new immigrants competing for scarce resources.
So we're talking about deep-seated systemic issues, and those issues have real consequences. Let's talk about the economic impact. What kind of damage are gangs doing to our economy?
Well, the numbers are pretty staggering. We're talking about billions of dollars lost every year.
Billions. Break that down for us.
Okay, so just on the direct cost side, you have law enforcement, which spends over $15 billion annually on gang-related activities.
Wow.
Then you have the cost of incarceration, which is another $15 billion per year. And that doesn't even include the court costs, the legal fees, all the other expenses associated with the criminal justice
So
system.
we're talking about over $30 billion right there,
Yeah.
just on the direct costs.
At least. And then you have to consider the indirect costs, which are harder to quantify but just as significant,
Like what?
like healthcare costs. When someone is injured in gang violence, the medical bills can be astronomical, and those costs get passed on to all of us in the form of higher insurance premiums.
Right.
And then you have the lost productivity. People who are involved in gangs are less likely to be employed, less likely to contribute to the economy.
Makes sense?
And then there's the impact on property values. When gang violence is rampant in a neighborhood, property values plummet, businesses close, and whole communities suffer.
And of course, there's the human cost, which is impossible to put a dollar figure on, but which has huge economic repercussions as well.
Absolutely. Every life lost to gang violence is a tragedy, and those losses ripple outward, impacting families, communities, and the economy as a whole.
So when you add it all up, direct costs, indirect cost, the human cost, what's the total economic impact of gangs in the U.S.?
Well, the National Institute of Justice put out a report in 2020 that estimated the total annual cost to be over $100 billion.
$100 billion. That's just, I don't even know what to say to that. It's overwhelming.
It is. It's a huge problem. But it's not an insurmountable problem.
That's what I wanted to get to. Are there programs, are there strategies that are actually working to reduce gang violence?
Yes, there are. And that's the really hopeful part of this story. There are things we can do, things that have been proven to work.
Okay, give us some examples.
One really promising model is called cure violence. And it's based on the idea that violence is a contagious disease.
A contagious disease, how does that work?
Well, just like a disease, violence spreads through communities. It has risk factors, it has vectors of transmission. And so cure violence uses public health strategies to interrupt that transmission.
So like instead of sending in the police, they send in what?
Doctors? Not doctors, but outreach workers. People from the community who are trained to mediate conflicts, to de-escalate situations, to provide support to those who are at risk of becoming involved in violence.
And it's working.
It is. In New York City, where cure violence has been implemented in several neighborhoods, there's been a significant reduction in shootings, like around 40% in some areas.
That's amazing. 40%, that's real progress.
It is. And it shows that we can make a difference if we take a different approach.
So what about other approaches? What about programs that focus on helping people leave gangs?
Those are crucial too. One great example is Homeboy Industries in Los Angeles.
I've heard of them. They do amazing work.
They do. They provide job training, education, counseling, tattoo removal, legal services, basically anything someone needs to get their life back on track.
And it sounds like it's working.
It is. They have a recidivism rate of only 15%, which is incredibly low compared to the national average of around 60%.
So they're really breaking that cycle of violence and incarceration.
They are. And they're doing it by investing in people, by giving them the support they need to turn their lives around.
So we have programs like Cure Violence that are focused on prevention, and programs like Homeboy Industries that are focused on intervention. And both are showing real results.
Right. And both are ultimately saving money in the long run.
Really? How so?
Well, think about it. Every time we prevent a shooting, every time we help someone leave a gang and stay out of prison, we're saving taxpayers a lot of money.
That makes sense.
The Justice Policy Institute has actually done some research on this, and they've found that for every dollar invested in youth prevention programs, we can save anywhere from $5 to $8 in future costs related to crime, incarceration, and healthcare.
So these programs are not only effective, they're actually cost-effective too. So why aren't we doing more of this? Why aren't we investing more in these programs that are clearly working?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? I think part of it is just a lack of awareness. A lot of people don't even know these programs exist.
Right.
And then there's the political will. It takes leadership, it takes vision, it takes a commitment to funding these programs over the long term.
And I imagine there are also challenges in terms of building trust within communities that have been historically marginalized and over-policed.
Absolutely. Trust is essential. And that takes time, it takes patience, it takes a willingness to listen and to understand the needs of the community.
Speaking of policy, isn't there a piece of legislation, the Youth Promise Act, that's designed to address some of these issues?
Yes, the Youth Promise Act is a federal bill that would provide funding for evidence-based prevention and intervention programs.
So it would provide the resources that these programs desperately need.
Exactly. And it has bipartisan support, which is really encouraging.
So there's hope that it might actually pass.
There is. And if it does, it could make a huge difference.
It would be amazing to hear from some of the people who are working on the front lines of this issue. Like, what would a researcher who studies gang networks say about all of this?
Well, someone like Dr. Andrew Papachristos, who's done a lot of fascinating work mapping gang networks, could really shed light on how these groups operate, how they recruit, how they maintain power.
And what about someone who works directly with gang members, someone who's trying to help them get out?
Someone like Father Greg Boyle, who founded Homeboy Industries, would have incredible insights into the challenges and the triumphs of that work.
And what about someone who's actually been through it, someone who was once a gang member but managed to turn their life around?
Those stories are incredibly powerful. And I think it would be really impactful to hear directly from someone who's lived that experience.
Maybe even just a short soundbite. Something like, I used to be lost, I used to be angry, I used to think this was my only option. But then I found program name, and they showed me another way.
Something like that. Something that really captures the transformative power of these programs.
So to recap, gang violence is a huge problem in America. It costs us billions of dollars every year, and it destroys countless lives. But it's not a hopeless situation.
Not at all. There are solutions out there. There are programs that are working.
And if we invest in those programs, if we support them, if we give them the resources they need, we can make a real difference.
We can reduce violence, we can save lives, we can build stronger communities.
And we can save money in the process.
Exactly.
So what can our listeners do? How can they get involved?
Well, there are a lot of things people can do. They can support organizations like Cheer Violence and Homeboy Industries. They can advocate for policies like the Youth Promise Act. They can volunteer their time at local community centers.
And they can educate themselves about the issue, right?
Absolutely. The more people understand about the root causes of gang violence, the more likely they are to support solutions.
And there's a really inspiring example of what's possible, right? What happened in Richmond, California.
Richmond is a great example of how a community can come together to address gang violence. They implemented a comprehensive strategy that involved law enforcement, social services, community organizations, and residents. And they saw a dramatic reduction in gun violence, something like a 66% decrease.
That's incredible.
It is, and it shows that change is possible.
So we want to thank all the researchers, the community leaders, the frontline workers, and everyone who's working to combat gang violence. You are truly making a difference.
And we want to thank our listeners for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you've learned something, and we hope you're inspired to take action.
If you'd like to learn more about this issue, there are some great resources available. The National Gang Center has a ton of information on their website.
You can also check out the websites for Cure Violence and Homeboy Industries.
And don't forget to look for local organizations in your own community that are working to address this issue.
Every little bit helps.
So we'll leave you with this thought. We know the cost of inaction. We know the human toll of gang violence. But we also know that there are solutions. So what will we choose to do?
The answer is up to all of us.
Thanks for listening.